Hi everyone, good to see you from this perspective behind this incredible thing. A little bit scary. I'm very happy that I'm allowed to stay with my legs here on the ground. And before we begin, let's say something from my heart. I'm deeply grateful to participate in a day like this. It's always good to be in a nice city. It's always a pleasure to see old and new friends, but I think what is going on, what we create together in a day like this is wonderful. There is energy in the air, there is respect, there is longing, there is humility, there is grief. I think there is Holy Spirit in the air. And I would like to praise Him for that and to thank all of you for creating this together, accepting this together. Secondly, it can be a blessing, can be a bit of a curse to be announced as the final speaker in a very long row of speakers. The good news is I am the last, so after this lecture it will be done. And I think I can address some topics that are pretty new compared to all the things that we have mentioned already. So I'll do my best to get you awake. And let's start as follows. I have a little invitation. Maybe you can close your eyes if you dare for a few seconds. And I would like to invite you to enter a sort of time machine. We enter, doors are closing, and when they open again, we are back in time, 35 years. So welcome to the year 1989. You may open your eyes if you still have closed them. Now, 1989 is a remarkable year for a couple of reasons, and I mentioned three of them. First, 1989 is a milestone in modern world history. It marks the end of what we used to call the Iron Curtain. In Berlin, the wall came down on November the 9th. So this Saturday, this will be exactly 35 years ago. And there will be an official remembrance ceremony in the German capital and in many other places. Secondly, 1989 is a milestone in modern missiology. An at that time not yet so famous Presbyterian pastor named Timothy Keller planted a new church in Manhattan and called it Redeemer. And one of its fruits is that we gather here today, 35 years later, as the European branch of a worldwide movement. And third, 1989 is the year in which an, at that time, quite famous British missiologist and bishop, Leslie Newbigin, published a book. And the title of that book is The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. Now, the title suggests that there is just one gospel and that there is a challenge because you seem not to simply proclaim this gospel. There is a sort of a problem because you have to communicate that gospel to a pluralist society. And therefore you have to understand what pluralism is all about. Now, I didn't know anything of Leslie Newbigin, only this title of the book. So I did a little bit of research for this lecture and I discovered that Newbigin himself had a very realistic time machine experience. Born in 1909 in the United Kingdom, he got a theological degree from Cambridge. And in 1936, he was ordained in this very city, in Edinburgh, as a missionary on behalf of the Church of Scotland. And his mission field was India, where he worked for almost 4 decades. Only in 1974, he moved back to the UK. So he left in 36, he came back in 74. Now imagine that you leave your city and country and that you would work for 40 years in a different part of the world and finally you would return. If you leave today, then that would be in the year 2064. So I'm almost 90 if I'm still alive at that time. And if you can imagine that for your own situation, then you got a clue of what Newbigin experienced. The world has changed a little bit. Newbigin left a more or less uniform Britain to return in a very pluralist environment. And this biographical experience enabled him to offer an analysis of what pluralism means. Now, a summary, a couple of his thoughts. First, pluralism, Newbigin says, has become the day-to-day experience of many modern people, especially those that live in big cities. There is diversity all over the place. And that is probably your experience as it is mine. In my borough in Amsterdam West, I'm surrounded every day by manifold flavors and colors and languages. And I do like that. We do like that. We are supposed to like that. But second, it's not only a day-to-day experience, plurality, it's also, Newbigin calls this a plausibility structure. And plausibility structure is a difficult word for what simply is a pair of glasses. The way we as a culture tend to look at things. For the majority of modern people in the West, pluralism is the best way, even the only way, to deal with affairs like politics and morality and religion and spirituality. There is simply no common framework anymore. There are multiple truths and worldviews. And Newbigin says, in the West, we not only accept this, but we celebrate this. We are proud of this. We think this to be a step forward compared to a society in which there is only one story or system, be it Christianity or communism or something like that. So Newbigin says pluralism, it's a day-to-day experience for many people in the modern world. It's a plausibility structure. And in the third place, he has an interesting remark. He says there are two strange exceptions in a plural world. Two strange exceptions. The first exception we call science. Science is something above pluralism, beyond pluralism. Science should be objective. And the second exception is capitalism. Because banks and worldwide corporates and stock markets, they together form a global system. And Apple and Google have one philosophy that works everywhere, from LA to Dhaka, Bangladesh. So together these things, science and capitalism, seem to be strange exceptions in a very pluralistic world. Now, Newbigin died in 1998. But what if we could transport him by that same time machine to our days, to today? Let's imagine he, Newbigin, would walk on the streets of Amsterdam or London or Berlin in 2024. What would he think? I think he would conclude that the world has become much more pluralistic compared to the time that he wrote that book 35 years ago. Why is that? Well, it's simply a matter of experience. In many streets and boroughs, there is much more diversity in terms of flavor and color and language than there was 35 years ago. There are also more people who are angry about this fact, but it is a fact. The world is getting more and more pluralistic. Second, it's also true that the world becomes more pluralistic in terms of plausibility structures. One of my favorite thinkers is the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, who just published his new book, Nexus. And Harari says, I often quote this in my Amsterdam circles, Harari says, most teachers today are more or less afraid to impose a certain worldview on their students. They're afraid for that. And instead of that, they deliver only data. An enormous amount of unconnected dots, and then they wish their students good luck to create a worldview out of all of that. I think that's a smart comment on what's going on in our society. So even more plural than 35 years ago, and I think Newbigin would be quite surprised about what happens to science and capitalism, because there is a remarkable shift in a more pluralistic direction. I mean this. Science is under attack nowadays. There are many conspiracy theories, especially since COVID. But also a great deal of scientists themselves are quite open to the idea that each single one of them has his or her personal view on things, even while being a scientist. Because you're always colored by the place of your birth, family circumstances, gender, etc., etc. So there is a little bit of a change. And yeah, capitalism is still dominant, but it is much more under attack than it was 35 years ago. And we may expect interesting things to happen in the next 4 years under the Trump administration, and maybe Elon Musk will play his part in that. There will be a lot of capitalism, but there will be much criticism as well. Now, if a publisher would decide to reprint New Biggins' book today, but in a somewhat updated version, it would not be wise to name it again The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. Even in 1989, that title was already a bit boring. So here's my suggestion to the publisher. I would call the updated version The Impossible Task of Communicating the One and Only Gospel in a Hyper-Pluralist Society. I think New Biggin could understand and would agree as a helpful summary of the situation. What I do in the rest of my talk is I try to do a little bit of helpful philosophy. That's the second part. And then I will do some compelling theology. I try to do that. That's the third part. And then there is also a very, very practical part at the end. So philosophy, theology, practical. Hyper-pluralism is a phenomenon that is also observed by a philosopher who is still alive, and he is also very old. His name is Charles Taylor from Montreal, Canada. Since the early 70s, Taylor is one of the leading thinkers on the field of humanities. He's a worldwide respected philosopher, and in 2007 he published a volume of about 1,000 pages entitled A Secular Age. I brought a very helpful summary. I'll put it down here. It's a summary of Jamie Smith with an endorsement from Tim Keller. It's only 100 pages. So if you do not like to read a volume of 1,000 pages, there is a very good summary. Taylor is a good storyteller. And he says, what I try to do in this very thick book is this. My question is, why is it possible that around the year 1500, in the western part of the world, almost everybody believes in God except some lunatics, while in the year 2000, in the same western part of the world, almost nobody believes in God anymore except a few lunatics? There's a bit of exaggeration in this statement, but I think bottom line, it is true. And Taylor says, I want to investigate what happened. What happened there? What sort of story can we tell about this development? And then he says, very interesting, he says, most people do have a very short answer to what happened. And then they say things like, well, in the past people were dependent on God, but nowadays we build our trust in science, medicine, technology, that kind of things. That's the shift. Or another one, in the past there was much more social pressure. Your family went to church, so you had to go to church, and nowadays you can do whatever you want. Like Michael said, our cultural narrative has completely changed. And Taylor says this is no nonsense, but it is way too simplistic. Way too much. It is simply untrue that a religious paradigm simply disappeared and now there is a secular paradigm. Very simplistic. The reality is much more complicated, and Taylor is brilliant in how he uses the word multi. For example, he says, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about it, he says there is no single secular way of thinking. He did a lot of research to the 18th century Enlightenment period of time. And he says that exactly the same Enlightenment is completely different in France, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, and there are even big differences between England and Scotland. So the Scottish way of enlightenment is a very different one than the English one. There is not one modern time. There are only multiple modernities. And then he goes on and he says the same is true for religion. There is no uniform Christianity. There is no uniform Roman Catholic Church. And there is definitely no uniform thing that we can call Protestantism. These are all very much pluralistic entities. And that's the reason that if you try to summarize their histories, the result is always a very, very, very thick book. This is complicated stuff, these things. And then he goes on, the same is true for all other sorts of spirituality. So there is no single Islam, as you know, probably. And there is no single Buddhism. Same pluralistic entities as the secular and the religious varieties. And then, as if that is not enough, there are all sorts of combinations possible. Now it's getting interesting. For example, New York columnist David Brooks says about himself, I'm partly Jewish, partly Christian, partly a spiritual seeker, and partly a secular atheist. And it's one and the same David Brooks, and people think him to be a wise person. If I would apply such a paradigm like this to myself, it is something like that, well, I'm raised as a sort of spiritual grandson of Abraham Kuyper in the Netherlands. But since my studies in Germany, I am more of a Lutheran than of a specifically Calvinist spirit. And after that, I was pretty much influenced by Anglicanism, with a bit of American Mennonite Stanley Howell was, always in the context of a deep understanding of Amsterdam secularism. That's basically me. Are you still with me? Taylor uses the metaphor of a supernova. And that's a term that stems from the world of physics, from astronomy. A supernova is the explosion of a star in which an enormous amount of light and energy breaks free. Now, a spiritual supernova refers to the process in the Western world in which the one dominant Christian framework explodes into thousands and thousands of possible worldviews. Among them, many non-religious, but many religious as well, and combinations of them we've never seen. Recently, I was invited to address a gathering of a Dutch denomination called Apostolic Society. And they describe themselves as partly religious, partly humanistic. And for a long time, that was simply an impossible combination, made no sense. But in today's world, it does. Because I know many people who cannot choose between these two options, these two worldviews. Partly religious, partly humanistic. And of course, there is not just one combination. There are many different options. That's pluralism. Back to Taylor and his supernova, the explosion of the more or less unified Christendom culture into an endless amount of beliefs and worldviews. You can describe an explosion in two ways. The first description is simply bang, and then you look a little bit frightened. And the second option is that you see it as an interesting release of energy. That's what an explosion is. Now, many Christians prefer the first one. They tend to value this supernova development in terms of loss. They're frightened. While many non-Christians are very positive about this development. They are very positive about the options today to make sense out of your life. They're very positive about the variety and the energy. Now, Taylor says, whoever you are, any human being in the West has to deal with a situation in which your personal beliefs are just an option among many. You simply cannot deny that. That doesn't mean that you can't have a firm belief. You can. And you can even wish that many others would share your belief. But even for the most dedicated among the group of firm believers, there glooms always something disturbing, something relativistic in the background. And I think that's basically the reason that so many people and have firm political, moral, religious convictions, and meanwhile are a bit frightened, a bit angry, and sometimes more than a bit. I think this is typically the world of today. To convince the people among you who say this is a little bit hard to accept for me, let me quote Thomas Halík, the famous theologian and priest from Prague. Halík says, if two people in the same worship service both confess, I believe in God, that doesn't mean that they both have the same idea. Their interior worlds, their understanding, and their religious experience can be very different. I like to stress this point a little bit because I think it's helpful to our city-to-city movement. I'm very grateful to be part of this network for more than 20 years now. The strong theological convictions of many friends here around are for me always a breath of fresh air compared to my own very liberal, very relativistic, very secular city and even church. I'm part of a mainline denomination in Amsterdam. So it's good to be here. Yes, there is a gospel and we should preach that. But let us also be aware or become more aware that using the same phrases is just one part of the coin. We are a small supernova in itself, in the way we are gathering already here in this church building. Everyone sits here with its own understanding and its own experiences. And I think Alex did a great thing to clarify that a little bit. And I believe that we can only grow together spiritually and emotionally by asking good questions, by careful listening, and by mutual encouraging. Now, the effect of this supernova has just begun, according to Taylor. Maybe we need a full 21st or even the complete 22nd century to come to terms with it. Tim Keller often started the sermon with the assumption that the 21st century in many ways resembles the first century. And indeed, both centuries are basically a multi-culture. The Roman Empire was a time of multi-nations, several languages, multi-beliefs, etc., especially in the big cities. But there seems also to be something new in our time, something unique. Probably we experience the first hyperculture in human history. Normally, political empires and systems have always been succeeded. But ours is an era not of succession, the one thing after another. Ours is a time of explosion. And it is ironic that Taylor originally had in mind to put a question mark after his main title, A Secular Age, question mark. But his publisher said, don't do that, that won't sell. But his conclusion in that thick book is unmistakable. There is and there will be no secular age. Neither can we return to a Christian era. We are on unknown territory. This is the supernova era, a time of many, multi, and hyper, the time of which New Begin saw only the beginnings, and maybe the same is true for us. Let's do a little bit of theology. I hope you're getting a bit nervous now. That's the point of the whole story. Could this be a time, a culture, that is in the end too pluralistic for the gospel? If we in this room already form a sort of supernova, for me it's interesting, no, hopeful, that the metaphor of that supernova already emerges in the biblical prehistory. I mean the story of Babylon from Genesis 11. That story sheds light on humanity wrestling to combine all its power and energy. There we see a culture of oneness. One city, one tower, one people. I quote from Genesis 11, "Let's make ourselves famous so we won't be plural. We won't be scattered across the earth." And we all know how this building project ends or stops halfway because of a big explosion of languages. Yes, this is a burden, even a curse. We experience that every day. But it is also true that this story tells about the release of lots and lots of energy. At once we see human beings on the move, spreading all across the globe. And very skillfully the Genesis redactor connects the dots of chapter 1 and chapter 11. Fill the earth. You can do that in only one God. This can only be done in a pluralist way, a supernova. We call ourselves city to city, not garden to garden. The big cities in today's world, all in its own manner, display the blessing in the disguise since Babylon. Many tongues, many languages, many cities, many nations. Partly by city to city, I learned to honor the diversity, also in the form of cities. Hamburg has its own identity, like London has, and Budapest, and Vienna, and Amsterdam, etc. The whole earth as one and the same big city is not only grotesque, it would also be very boring. Let me add 3 other theological comments. First, the God of Genesis 11, our God, is not the God of the one big tower. He doesn't like that. He is the inventor of the many languages, of the scattering. God is a God of multi-planets, multi-plans, multicultural, multi-ethnic. And therefore you may expect to experience more of God in a pluralist or even in a hyper era than in a simply uniform culture, I believe. Like long ago, the Israelites discovered the real heart of God, not in their one and only capital or temple. They discovered the heart of God in the hyper city of that later Babylon, the empire of the 6th century before Christ. I would even go so far that we in the West may expect quite a lot of God in 2024. More than in, let us say, 1924 or 1824. Plurality is only a real curse for the people of the tower. People who treat unity as an identity idol. People who in the end like to be God themselves. But it is a remarkable blessing, plurality, to everyone who believes that only endless diversity glorifies a magnificent creator, who himself is not the one. The ancient Christian creeds learn us to think of God, to pray to God as triune, three in one. There is already plurality in God. And you know that this is the big fight between Christianity and Islam, if that is true or not. Second theological comment, yes, there is only one gospel. That is what I believe. Traditionally, it's just one word, the gospel. And that word is incarnation. God with us. God takes flesh. This is utter nonsense, or the cornerstone of everything else. But already the Gospels in the New Testament are fourfold. Obviously, what happens there is too big for just one witness or one perspective. And the Apostle Paul continues. The Jews sometimes need a different explanation and application than the Greeks do. And the letter to Galatia contained different topics in comparison to the letters to Timothy, etc. So to believe in Jesus, friends, is for none of us a quick escape out of pluralism. Can't be. In that case, there would be no need for a Holy Spirit. Jesus is a face, a voice, a living Lord, the only common thread through the labyrinth, the Babylonic confusion that is part and parcel of human history and often also of our personal lives. Thank God that there is something as this common thread. What a thread, what a friend we have in Jesus. Last theological point, history will not end with the concept of oneness. Yes, the New Jerusalem is a big city again, but there is no temple, there is no tower, there are multi-tongues and nations, and nobody will call God the one. Glory and splendor are human descriptions for an eternal and manifold creator. In the end, God will be all in all. And I think that means something as that the supernova, that is so frustrating often for all of us, may you be church planters or world leaders or whatsoever, this frustrating supernova in the end will not be destroyed, it will be glorified. And we need all the planets and all the cities and all the human beings to reflect God's glory. I promise you a very practical end of my lecture, and meanwhile I'm grateful for your attention still. This is the last part. What's the point of all the things that I try to say? The point has something to do with this. In the Western situation, many Christians and churches feel so much overwhelmed by a pluralist society that they simply lose trust in the power of the gospel. And if there is no gospel, there is no need for any outsider to join the church. This is the dying form of Christianity in many Protestant circles. But there are nowadays also many Christians and churches who have either no clue of pluralism or they try consciously to deny it. And they preach a gospel, but always in the same manner and mostly with a loud voice. And they believe their city would be a better place if everyone would speak their language. This is the pretty fundamentalist way of Christianity that I see in many charismatic churches, but not only there, you can find it as well among conservative reformed people. Friends, I want to tell you that our cities are in need not of more relativism or more fundamentalism. And by that I do not mean to make harsh judgments about others. We here have a responsibility for our movement and for ourselves. We are called for a different type of being Christian and being church. And by that I mean Christians that inhabit plurality and know a spiritual way of overcoming it. I wish that all of us could be the spiritual grandchildren of not only New Begin and maybe Charles Taylor, but also of St. Augustine and St. Paul. And I will end with 4 starting points very shortly, 4 ways to connect with this, how to overcome plurality. 1, very good news, this first one. Where plausibility structures fall apart, and that happens all the time today, where plausibility structures fall apart, one question turns up more and more, and that one and only question is, what is the meaning of life? A hyper-pluralistic society sees a remarkable but predictable comeback of that question. What's the meaning of life? Everybody seems to have that question. And we should offer many different classes and small groups and retreats. And they should be different in language and in depth and in length. Yes, that's hard work. But the good news is the underlying question is always the same. And by God's grace, by doing this, we can become better and better in how to answer it. It's not all plurality what it looks like. Some questions are that basic that they are the same in every place and in every time. That's the first one. Second one, I believe that we need people, especially in cities, that speak more than one language. And by that I mean, first of all, literally languages. You may speak English and also Arabic or German in my case. That's helpful, that you do not speak only your own language. So credits to all the people here, including myself, for who English is their second or third language. But I also practiced some subcultural languages. For example, in my situation, a bit of the language of the boardroom, or of the dance industry, or of the police. And above all, I mean, with different languages, we should speak, each single one of us, we should speak more than one spiritual language. I learned from a Danish colleague from Aarhus that already New Begin suggests that we can inhabit multiple plausibility structures at the same time. We as Christians, New Begin says, we can change glasses, but then we need more than one pair of them. Let's think about it. How to explain the gospel in more than one language for yourself. Third out of four, we can benefit very much, that's also my personal experience, we can benefit very much from networks of translators, like we try to be here. I do have many colleagues in Amsterdam that are much better in all sorts of languages than I am. And I'm grateful for that. And I think that's what church is all about. It's beautiful to hear each other communicate the gospel in different tongues. And then not based on Babylonian confusion, but on holy spiritual connection. So also our city networks can be little supernovas in a very positive meaning. We need each other. As St. Paul once said, we need each other to understand something of the length and the height and the depth of God's love. And finally, we are in a pluralistic time, we are in need of doers. Maybe I was a little bit too fast or philosophical, then that's my fault, I should have done better. But I try to reflect on what I have learned over the last couple of years, but there is an iron law in the kingdom of God. Doers always have priority over thinkers. That's always the case. And in a pluralist society, there are many misunderstandings and conflicts in every area. We need people who are equipped to deal with other people who are different. People that are not shy, but are also not too much focused on their own language. I think the modern world is in great need of peacekeepers. And no matter how theological or philosophical we are, let's pray to be peacekeepers in a very practical way in the first place. That's what I'd like to share with you this afternoon. Again, thank you very much for staying with me. It was a pleasure to do it. Of course, I'm hanging around tonight and tomorrow. And there are some questions again to discuss that for yourself.